Hello, my name is Jörg and welcome to coachRED.net. In the last video we created a to-do and in this one we update a to-do. The updating will be done via inline editing. That means that next to the done field and the task I also need a variable to toggle between the editing modes. First I create a new page variable called to-do list. The value type is a list. The item type is an object. So far I have created a list of objects with one property, ID. ID is supplied by Appgyver. Now I can add the new properties which I want in the list. The first one is done. Done is not a text field but true false. Next property is task. That is the text field. The edit mode toggle I call editing and it is a true false field as well. Next property is the object ID. We haven't talked about it. If I want to update a specific record, I need to provide Sashido with the object ID. To illustrate, I head over to the Sashido dashboard. Each row has a unique object ID. When reading the rows from the database, Sashido provides the object ID to us. I create a property to store it for each list item. The new to-do list is complete. In the View section, I select the checkbox and change the repeat with to the new list. That's all fine and dandy, but how is the data actually coming into the list? For the answer, I head over to the variables section to the data variable todos1 and have a look at the logic. On a high level, this says when the page is mounted, the get record collection gets the data from the Sashido database and sets the data variable todos1 with the output of this get record collection. The get record collection is repeated every 5,000 milliseconds. Alright, now I know how to get data from the Sashido database, but this particular one I don't want, so I erase the connection. To create the data retrieval collection, I head over to the View section, click on the page, and here I see the page mounted event. When the page is mounted, I want to get the to-dos from the Sashido database, so I drag in a get record collection and connect it to the page mounted. The resource name points to to-dos, that's fine. Next, I want to set the page variable to-do list to the outcome of the get record collection. The database and the to-do list have different structures. To remedy, I use the map function to transform the output of the get record collection to fit the to-do list. The map function has two parameters. The first one is the list of items to transform. In my case, it is the output of the get record collection. It is a bit hard to see here. The output gives me a couple of options. We need the second one, and you see it with the example that it actually is a list of our records. That's what we need. The second parameter of map is the transform formula. This is basically a JSON object of the data I want to create. In the documentation of the map function, I see that I have two context variables here in blue. The first one is the item. The current item is what I need in my case. The first key I defined for my JSON object is done, and the value of done is item.done. So it's the done value of the current item. The next key is task, and again the value of task is item.task. Next is the object ID. So I got all three items from the get record collection output. Next is my editing toggle. I can set it always to false because when I'm reading the list, none of my items should be in editing mode. I get a warning that the list items aren't compatible. I didn't set the ID field that Appgyver automatically put into my list. So that's okay. Great. So when the page is mounted, the data gets into our list. But what about when I create a new task? I need to take care of that now. I don't want to repeat myself getting the data from the database into the to-do list. In Appgyver, I can create my own flow functions. First step is to disconnect data collection from the page mounted. Next, I select both the get record collection and set page variable with the shift key down. On the right side under properties, I click on create new flow function. Et voila, flow function 1 is created. The flow function is connected to the page mounted event again. Plus I also need to set the resource name in the get record collection. So I double click on my flow function and set the resource name to to-dos. Great, over to the button to use our new flow function. The logic here is that once the record is created, I am using flow function 1 to update my list of tasks. Again, in my flow function 1, I need to set the resource name for get record collection to to-dos. Alright, data gets into our list. Now I concentrate on the UI. First is to convert our checkbox field to a regular container element. The conversion mixed up the layout a little bit, so I go into Style and set the layout to horizontal. I want to edit the task right in line, so the label element goes and gets replaced by an input element. Each line gets 3 icons. To hold them, I use a container and drag in 3 icons. The layout isn't quite there yet. I start with cell number 2 and set that to horizontal and to spread the elements as far apart as possible. Moving to the contents of cell 2, I convert the input field to a regular container. The label of the input field goes, and the input field itself shouldn't have the bottom border. I can set that in the style section. The font size of the input field is a bit smaller than the regular font. I set the font size to the usual 18. Now the binding of the text input, I set that to the current item in repeat, our task. In the preview I see that the task is too close to the checkbox, so I set the left padding of cell 2 to 12. The task looks fine and is bound to the correct value. Now off to the icons. First, the layout of the container gets to be horizontal, right aligned and centered. Next is the left margin of 12 for each of the icons to give it a little bit more space. Now changing the icons to depict what they actually do. The right one is an edit, the middle one a check, and the left one is to delete. The icons shouldn't be all visible at the same time, but let's start with the task field. When I'm not editing, this input field should be disabled. The editing toggle of the line comes in handy here. I set the disabled logic of the input box to not current editing. Okay, this is double negation here. So what it means is if I'm not in editing mode, the input field is disabled. The visibility logic of the next 2 icons are straightforward. I can link them to my editing toggle. So I set the visibility to property of item in repeat and then the editing. The edit icon should only be visible when I'm not in editing mode, so I apply the formula not current editing again. I save the app and see in the preview that the 2 icons are indeed not visible anymore. All right, the UI is looking good. Now to the logic of things. When I'm pressing the edit button, I want to set my editing toggle for that particular line. It means that I'm setting a page variable, but my page variable is a list of objects. So I need to get to the current object. With setItemAdd, Appgyver provides the right function for that. SetItemAdd has three parameters. The first is the list of items. In my case, it is the page variable to-do list. The second one, the index, is the position within the list. I get that with the indexOf function. It has two parameters. The first is the list, which in our case is the page variable to-do list again, and the item is the current item. The third parameter of setItemAdd is the new item formula. We already know that from the map function. It is a JSON object listing all the keys and the values. The first key is done with the value current.done. The second one is task with the value current.task. The third key is object ID with the value current.objectID. And finally, I get to what I actually want to change. So the key editing I set to true. All right, I'm done with the edit icon. Next is the check icon. Tapping the check icon should actually update our record. Before I can use the update record, I need to enable it and configure it in the data section. But what should I actually configure? I get the answers in the REST API guide from Sashido. So the headers seem to be all the same. I have a data section, yes, and I need to provide the unique ID. All right, that's all I need to know. Back to Appgyver. I have learned that I need to provide the object ID, and that comes right behind the classes with this slash. So I defined a variable slash curly brackets ID and then the URL placeholder and call that ID as well. This one is not static and it is not optional. The rest actually looks fine, so back to the flow function update record. The resource name is okay, it's to-dos, and here the ID, that's the parameter we just defined. So I can set this one as property and item and repeat, and the current object ID. The record properties, that's my JSON object. I can define it as a formula. Starting with the curly brackets, all I need to define is the key task and the value is the current.task. The other keys of this record stay the same, so I don't need to list them here. Next step is to set the editing toggle to false. I'm a bit lazy here, so I copy the set page variable from my edit button and paste it in here. All I need to do is set the editing key to false in the formula. I save the app and grab my phone to see if it works in the preview mode. First I create a new item. We change the logic to update the list here. And it works, perfect. Next I tap edit on the new item. The inline icons change visibility, great. Next I change the task and press update. The icons change again and the task is updated. Great! Next is the checkbox. I select it and drag in an update record on the component on change event. The resource name is okay, to-dos. The IDs I set to the current object ID, just as I've done before. The record properties is the JSON object, which I can set via a formula. The only key I need to set is the done key, and the value of the key I get from the prior node, so output of another node, and here I get the event value, so that is a true or a false. Testing time finally, so I can toggle the checkbox on and off, but is it really in the database? Let's see on the Sashido dashboard. Yes, it is. Perfect. So that concludes the video on the updating of the to-dos. Next is the deletion of to-dos. See you there.